Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game. So, taking out a super fun and super exciting episode for you guys this evening because we're going to be talking about the 90s. I consider this to be the most influential decade in video game history, moving the medium that we enjoy so much so far forward that it's absolutely mind-blowing where you end up in 1999 or where you start in 1990. And this is a little preview of a series I have in progress that I'm working on now, where I take a look at what I consider the most influential game of every single year. But honestly, the 90s were a wild time, not just because I grew up in them and I was playing video games all the time. It was just the #1 decade for the evolution of the medium of video games, because in 1991 Sonic the Hedgehog gets introduced to the world, and by the end of the decade you're playing something like Sonic Adventure on the Dreamcast. To think that these two games came out in the same decade, let alone 8 years apart, going from 16-bit 2D graphics to something like Dreamcast in your living room, there's never been a decade before or since where there's been such an evolutionary shift in what video games were. Before we get too far involved, do me a huge favor, down below, hit like and subscribe and ring that notification bell. Definitely helps us out. If you feel so inclined to want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But every single time I think about the evolution of video games, the 90s always pops into my head, because you get something like Super Mario World in 1990 and the Super Nintendo, which was such a leap over the original NES or Famicom. When this came out, it absolutely took the world by storm. Everyone wanted a Super Nintendo. Everyone wanted to play Super Mario World. This I would still consider to be an absolute 10 out of 10 perfect game. Everything about Super Mario World still hits. There's still a metric ton of fan ROMs as well as Kaizo hacks, basically giving Super Mario World an infinite lifespan. And to say that this game was just absolutely mind-blowing when you first saw it in 1990 would be an understatement. This was something that was just absolutely revolutionary. But to think that only 6 years later we would be playing Super Mario 64 on the Nintendo 64, a fully realized 3D version of Mario, is just absolutely staggering. Remember that Super Mario 3 wasn't that old when 1990 rolled around, and to have something like Super Mario 64 in 1996 on the Nintendo 64 just basically gave you the promise of 3D gaming in your home. Sure, the Sega Saturn and the PlayStation 1 existed and they were huge evolutionary leaps as well, but something like this just shows how much gaming changed in basically 5.5 years. Playing Super Mario 64 after playing the Super Nintendo felt like you had basically gone into the future, and suddenly you had this powerful 3D console in your living room or your bedroom and you were playing something that you had never seen before. And that's why the 90s to me are just so synonymous with what video games became. They were basically learning how to make 3D games in this decade, and sure, PlayStation 2 to PlayStation 3, the standard definition to HD era jump is important. Foundationally, video games still kind of had the same overall flow, but taking a look at something like a Sonic Adventure boss fight against Dr. Eggman here in full 3D with all of these amazing graphics for the time and era is just so much fun to see. And remember, 8 years previous, this is what a Sonic the Hedgehog boss fight looked like against Dr. Eggman. This is probably the single biggest leap I've ever seen in one video game generation to the other by the end of the decade. Sure, you had Sega Saturn in between, but you go from 16-bit 2D Sonic to a fully realized 3D world in Sonic Adventure. It is just a huge leap in the technology, in the gameplay. You get a completely new dimension on this. And when you were a kid in the 90s, seeing this sort of stuff just blew your mind. And if you didn't grow up in that era, maybe it doesn't hit the same for you. So you tell me, what was your primary video game era growing up? Were you playing a lot in the 90s? Were you a 2000s kid? I would be really curious, because YouTube says most of you should have been around in the 90s playing games based upon my demographic data, but I'm never quite sure how right that is. So I would be genuinely curious just to see who was playing these games in the 90s. And trust me, playing Sonic the Hedgehog in 1991, it was one of the most fun games you could play. It was absolutely outstanding. Everyone loved this thing. Sonic Mania was going wild in the world the same way that Super Mario World hit in 1990. And it is kind of fun to think that Sonic's first true appearance in his own video game happened in 1991. You think Sonic's been around forever, but his first full game was in 91, and that's just wild to think about. But even the sound changed, so go ahead and listen and hear what Sonic sounded like in 91 and then in 99, and I'll be right back with a lot more gaming. Both musical samples are amazing, but it is such a tonal shift in just how good of sound quality we could get out of a video game console. Or think of something like the first-person shooter. When Wolfenstein 3D hit the markets, it was absolutely a hit for id Software, and it would bring us into the Doom franchise, which is still today ported to every single piece of hardware that it could possibly run, because the question, but does it run Doom, has become synonymous with video game hardware. But there was a time and place in which Wolfenstein 3D was a launch game. This thing came out, blew everyone's mind. The first-person shooter really became alive with this game. And then think where we were just a few years later on the Nintendo 64 with GoldenEye. Sure, I jumped over Doom, but at the beginning of the 90s, you have something like Wolfenstein 3D, and in the middle of the 90s, you're onto stuff like a fully 3D polygonal world in GoldenEye on Nintendo 64. And this game just hit when it came out. It was absolutely mind-blowingly fun, and you and your friends would play 4-player death matches to the early morning. You'd have a sleepover, you'd have pizza and soda, and you'd have a ton of fun doing it. And still to this day, we do the exact same thing. Not many sleepovers and the sodas turn to beer, but people get together and play this because they still love it. And to think that Wolfenstein 3D kicked off the craze that GoldenEye then continued, and then of course at the end of the decade we move over to something like Half-Life, which created the overall narrative arc of what a first-person shooter could be when it wasn't more of a corridor or level-based shooter like something like Doom or Wolfenstein. And that is just insane. They even brought a lot of light horror elements into Half-Life, and to think that at the beginning of the decade you were playing Wolfenstein 3D and at the end you were playing Half-Life is wild. Not even to mention horror. This is the decade where survival horror is basically created. Sure, you have something like Sweet Home on the Famicom, and that could be technically considered survival horror because Resident Evil was basically a pseudo remake homage to that game. But in the 90s, Resident Evil came out, and you basically saw a brand new genre created in front of your eyes. Survival horror didn't really exist before this game, outside of some small examples on the PC effects like Team Innocent, and this all happened again in the 90s, and we've been playing Resident Evil ever since. Obviously now it's moved into the first-person perspective, and we have some VR as well, but that is where this all foundationally comes from. One experimental game from Capcom in the mid-90s where they thought to themselves they could basically make a horror game that felt like something that no one had ever done before, outside of like an example of Alone in the Dark. Or even on the fighting game genre, the Neo Geo AES and MVS, coming out in 1990 in the arcades and 91 at home, brought a full arcade board into your living room, and you were absolutely blown away by what you saw. But think of something like King of Fighters 94, obviously released in 1994, to something like Soul Calibur on PlayStation 1 based arcade hardware. It goes from 2D to 3D, and you get a pretty big graphical jump. But of course then by the end of the decade, you would have another version of Soul Calibur running on the Sega Dreamcast, and this back then, you never thought graphics were going to get any better than something like Soul Calibur on Dreamcast. The fluidity, the frame rate, the amount of polygons was mind-blowing, and we were playing stuff like Street Fighter 2 at the beginning of the decade, King of Fighters in the middle, and then by the end of the 90s, this is what graphics in a fighting game could look like in your living room. You didn't have to go to the arcade like in the mid-90s to play a version of Soul Calibur. You'll see here there's a lot of pixels because it is based on PlayStation 1 hardware. You could go home, you could turn your Dreamcast on, and have a piece of hardware that was basically a lighter version of a Sega Naomi in your living room, and that would just absolutely blow your mind. And still looking at this footage here, it blows my mind that this is how far we went in the 90s. From 1990 to 1999, the world of video games just absolutely changed. And again, I think the number one example for me is Sonic the Hedgehog. This game, the original, is still fun, even though I think Sonic the Hedgehog 2 is probably the best game in the 2D franchise. But honestly, think of it this way. In 1991, this is what a Sonic game looked like, and in 1999, this is what a Sonic game looked like. If you told anybody in the beginning of the 90s that you would be playing in this level of 3D by the end of the decade, I don't think anyone would believe you, because for the most part, 3D was just the domain of arcades and then some PCs once 3D accelerators came along. But again, this is why I consider the 90s to be the most important decade in video game history. 3D was invented, so many different genres were invented, and you go from 2D in the 16-bit era to something like Dreamcast. But expect a lot more of these type of videos because I got a series coming, and tell me your favorite 90s game down below. Bye-bye.